WNST. It's Alice in Baltimore, and funny until I get the fishing rod out of my mouth. I am Nestor. He is Luke Jones. And, Luke, it was ugly at Yankee Stadium this weekend, was it not?
Well, when you when you give up 8 runs on Friday night, and that's your best pitching performance of the weekend, what else is there to say? I mean, they're outscored 38-8 over the 3-game set. And let's get this first part out of the way before we dive into the Orioles, and there's plenty to discuss.
Okay.
The New York Yankees are really good.
Okay,
fair enough.
They've
done this against a lot of teams. And for many people like myself who thought they were a year away, I think we're quickly finding that that's not the case. I mean, they're 14 over 500, plus 115 run differential. I mean, it's only because of the Houston Astros are we not talking about the Yankees as being a complete shock. I mean, the Astros have run away with their division. They deserve plenty of credit, but the Yankees are really, really good. That said, that does not mean that the Orioles aren't really, really bad. And they have been for about a month now, and as much as we talked about 22-10 to start the season, I think we all agreed that they weren't a team truly reflective of that kind of record. On the flip side, you look at them and they've gone, 9-20 since then. I don't know if they're that bad of a team either, but it is getting harder and harder to envision this team competing. And
it feels that they're closer to a 400 team than a 600 team, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just at this point you're really starting to wonder if this is going to be a team, even when they get Manny Machado back, and assuming Zach Britton comes back.
And Adam Jones is not right. Make that clear.
Well, but, even if they get some of those players back and some other guys start performing at their career levels, and there's been some underperformance, no doubt, offense and defense, or offense and pitching and defense, quite frankly. But all of that said, you're really starting to wonder if this is a team that's even going to be sniffing 500, let alone competing for a wild card spot in the AL. I mean, it's not good. There's no way to really sugarcoat it. There are lots of different tentacles to this. The hitting is underperformed, sure. The defense isn't what it was a couple years ago, sure. But when you enter Sunday with the worst road ERA in the major leagues by about 0.35 runs from the 29th place team, which was San Diego, and then you give up 14 more runs in the finale in the Bronx, what else is there to say? I mean, this is just a horrendous pitching staff.
And I don't, when blame time comes, it's fire Dan Duquette. It's what's with Buck, what's with the scouts, what's with all of this. A lot of this does go back to when you have an owner that says, I want Chris Davis, and then says, here's the new budget. I'm going to pull $24 million out for you, and we're going to do it this way. I don't know what to say. I think there's plenty of blame, but I think it's so across the board, and this is such an unorthodox franchise in general. Now, Ken Rosenthal reported this weekend that, all is not well between Buck Showalter and Dan Duquette. That shouldn't come as a shock to anyone. We've been through this for years. The Duquette to Toronto thing is the most bizarre management thing in the history of modern sports. I mean, I don't know what else there is to say. The guy wants to go. You get a first-round draft pick in exchange. You get a player. You get some money. You get some consideration, and you let him go run the Blue Jays. You don't do it this way. So, to blame it on any one person or any one series of events, I think the Orioles have had a lot of good fortune here, despite what has been horrendously poor ownership for a quarter of a century, and a lot of money that has flooded into their pockets, some of which they've spent, some of which they've pocketed, and they've had a nice little run here. But, along this run, there haven't been a whole lot of, these massive bumps in the road. I mean, the Markakis injury, Wieters has had some injuries. Obviously, Manny Machado had a couple of years. The Davis suspension. They've had stuff happen, but never where it kind of goes cold and getting kind of cold toward the end, and then you mix in this Machado, Adam Jones, Britton free agency, you mix in these injuries, you mix in maybe some mixed feelings in the front office, you mix in Brady Anderson, and more than that, there's no answer. There's no way, they don't have anywhere to go for pitching. They're going to pitch through with what they have, and if that's this Crichton or if Yacobonis. My wife came in the 6th inning of the game. Not only is it 13 to whatever it was, but she's like, who the hell are these guys? And I'm like, well, this is where they are, man. All the rest of these guys aren't doing it, and they don't. Gary Thorne is indicting the whole organization in the 7th inning by saying Buck Showalter had all of the minor league pitching stats, and he's trying to find somebody that hasn't been here to come up that might be able to pitch in. It's insane.
Yeah, there's no way to sugarcoat it because the last thing you just said, where's the help coming from? Back in April when they were performing and winning games despite the fact that their starting rotation certainly wasn't firing in a way that it needed to, you pointed to Chris Tillman, right? And when Zach Britton came back the first time around, you said, okay, well, they got Zach Britton back. He goes back on the DL. Now, we'll see how this plays out. The way it looks, he's going to be starting a rehab assignment here over the next 7 to 8 days, assuming his final bullpen goes well. So, okay, great. You can get him back. You hope to get Darren O'Day back. That's fine. But when you have a starting rotation that you have one guy that you feel good about, that math doesn't add up. That's not to say you can't win any other games at all when someone else starts, but it becomes incredibly difficult. And
especially against teams that can hit in bad environments, especially in this bandbox we have here, right? This is a disaster on a 94-degree day as far as pitching goes in Baltimore.
Well, the funny thing is, their team ERA has actually been pretty good in Baltimore. Go look at the numbers.
But we haven't had hot nights yet.
I agree, but they've actually pitched okay in Baltimore. They've been horrendous on the road, and clearly, if you're going to be a team that's sniffing the playoffs, you have to at least find a way to be okay on the road, and they haven't done that. But we can talk about the big picture issues, and certainly there's going to be a lot of that. I saw what Rosenthal had to say about Buck Showalter and Dan Duquette. That's nothing new, and that's not to discredit Ken. He's an amazing reporter, but we know that, and they've succeeded.
What do you think the problems are? If pitching, depth, who's on the farm, who's coming to help me out? Because Buck doesn't manage the minor league system. He's got his hands full doing this, right?
Well, it's all those things. It isn't just one thing. It's just not. First of all, start off with the fact that you didn't think they were a contending team going into the season. I thought they were at least contending for a wild card kind of caliber club. I think I picked 85 and 77.
I had them at 78 wins, and I'm sticking okay with that right now.
But when you look at it, they haven't had Zach Britton most of the season. Manny Machado has been way below where you expected him to be. Those two players right there, if you want to look at wins above replacement, they were worth 11 wins above replacement right there. So right there,
they are two of the top 50 baseball players on the planet, right?
So right there, you start with that, and then you go to Kevin Gausman, who, forget about him taking a step forward to become an ace like people were talking about. This is a guy that's been a shell of what he was the last 3 years, which was, at the very least, a solid major league starting pitcher. He's got an ERA of 6.5. That's completely unacceptable. You go to Chris Tillman, who I think at this point, whether his arm is hurting him or not, isn't really the issue. I think it's very clear that he's either hurt or he's altered his mechanics in a way to avoid hurting his shoulder that he's not the same guy. Because what we saw on Saturday night, that was sad watching him perform the way he did on Saturday night. Knowing how important that guy's been to their run over the last 5 years. But so you look at that. You look at the bullpen without Britton and O'Day. They basically are down to two guys that they trust in relief. They haven't gotten help from the minor leagues. Jimmy Yacobonis is one of the few guys that's pitched well at AAA that we hadn't seen. Had a very rough debut. We'll see. I would assume he'll get another opportunity. At some point, you can't just keep sending guys down to the minors because you only have so many you can call up.
Dude, it's incredible because, I sit here and talk to visiting teams, and I'll talk to the White Sox. I'll talk to some of the Cardinals people this week, and I go to WNST.net, and I can see, the stats, right? It's the AP stats that I use our website whenever I do radio here, and it is unbelievable the amount of pitchers, just the length of the depth of the 25. How many guys has it been? Is it 25? Am I wrong?
Oh, it's I haven't looked, but it's been up there. That in and of itself isn't incredibly new. They've used their roster a lot. The problem is that you're not getting any semblance of quality from most of these individuals.
By the way, I have 23 is the number, but go ahead.
Right. In the past, they've rotated guys in and out, the T.J. McFarlands and different guys like that, but they would at least get some stretches of quality from some of those guys, and then you'd send someone down because you needed a fresh arm or, someone get hurt or whatever, and then you'd go through it that way. But this has just been shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic, and it has been for most of the season. They've gotten, Alec Asher's given them some highlights, but there have been some definite lowlights, especially since they put him in the rotation. And, Gabe Yanoa gave them that one really good outing, and Jason Aquino gave them a good outing. But, these are all singular events. You're not having any of these individuals other than Asher really pitching out of the bullpen for the better part of a month where you said, there's a guy that's really helped them out. I mean, it hasn't been there. It's one thing to say you have depth. They have inventory. They haven't had any depth. You can have a bunch of guys with options that you can call up and send down, and that's well and good. But if you're not going to get anything of quality from them, you're just spinning your wheels. All you're doing is preventing guys from getting hurt. Really, that's all you're accomplishing with having that. So you look at that, and then you look at the lineup. And other than Jonathan Scope and Trey Mancini, who else can you really look to and say that they've performed at a level that you would have expected? Davis, pretty disappointing. Machado, we've talked about. Seth Smith has been okay, but hasn't been anything special. And
Castillo's been a nice pickup, by the way.
Well, but he's been on the DL twice now. So, look, I'm not blaming him for taking a shot to the groin area. Glad to go to the DL, but if you're not on the field, you're not helping the club. I mean,
Caleb Joseph. I mean, the catching position has been.
That's been okay.
It's been fine.
It's been okay.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you look at the heart of their order. You look at the guys that you've counted on over the last several years, and look how many guys aren't getting the job done. I mean, it's been a collective effort. Yes, you point to the pitching first and foremost as saying that's the biggest reason why this team has completely fallen apart over the last month. But we've talked a lot about the offense. They entered Sunday, I think 19th in the majors in runs scored per game. Somewhere 8th or 9th in the majors or in home runs. I mean, that's not what this team was constructed to do. So you can blame the coaching, you can blame the players, you can blame management. I mean, they all take some blame. I mean, that's obvious, but it just adds up to having a club that, even if you didn't think it was all that good to begin with and you thought it was kind of mediocre to begin with, then you take in the underperformance from guys that have track records and the injuries that they've had, some key performers. And it's almost, you look at it from that lens, it's almost miraculous that this team is 31-30 as they finish up, now getting into the middle of the third month of the season. I mean, from that standpoint, it's almost amazing that they're, collective effort hovering around 500, even though we know over the last month it's been way worse than that.
Well, they're visiting Chicago, the worst team in the American League, the next couple of days. They'll get St. Louis this weekend here at Camden Yards. Luke Jones joining us here. You can find him at Baltimore Luke, as well as Luke at WNST.net. I am working at half speed because I bit a hole in my tongue. For those of you who follow me on the internet over the weekend, it was lovely. I didn't show the video, but it was. But then I had to sit around and watch the Orioles, and I couldn't even scream out loud. I could scream a little bit on the internet, but one of the real problems here, and I think that this is where Rosenthal would go with this if he were still writing at the Baltimore Sun. What's the big picture? There's a draft, right? And Duquette's been talking about drafting and pitchers and all of this stuff like he's really going to be around in 2020 or 2021. And I know the thought of Buck being 61 years old and maybe wanting to be the general manager, the thought that maybe Peter won't be around at some point to run this place and it will be run by different people or there will be a different voice at some point during the tenure. But this is really where it gets critical, where you look at the team like the Yankees did last year and had a sell-off. And they had a mindful, thoughtful, they put 3 months into it. They didn't shimmy when there were signs of life. They went all the way in. Some teams have done that in history. Some teams haven't. But to your way of thinking, not me, because you know what I think of it, one of the hardest things to do here is to know when to hold them and know when to fold them long term. And I don't know that they really have the right pieces here. If it's Dan Duquette, Peter Angelos, Showalter coming up on the end of a managerial deal where he could go into the market 18 months from now and wind up kind of wherever he wanted to wind up, or wait it out for a gig if that's what he wanted to do after, unless he really likes it here, which, we'll find out. But all of that goes into, are they going to deal Machado? Are they going to deal a healthy Britton? Are they going to do something that other teams would be thinking really, really hard about doing right now? Even if they didn't do it, there would be a measurement, there would be a strategy, there would be a plan, there would be a we'll only deal Machado if this happens. But I don't think the fan base would be up in arms. And quite frankly, since when the hell did they care about the fan base?
Well, it comes down to this. They basically have about a month to talk about and evaluate and decide what you're suggesting there. I mean, it comes down to this. What they are right now, they're 31-30. We can look at the last month, but in totality, they're 31-30. There are 3 games out of the first wild card as they get into the start of a new week. I mean, that's where they are. So it's not as though they're 20 games below 500, but you do have to look at the next month and got to kind of decide where are you going now. And a lot of it does come down to what is the future of Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter. Now, I've said to you, it's of my opinion that Dan Duquette's not going to be back. I don't think he's going to want to come back, but I've also said that it doesn't behoove him to mail it in that things are done in a way that this thing completely falls apart over the next, 16 months, and then he's out of a contract and, a team that hypothetically is in last place next year. And I'm not saying they will be, but if that kind of scenario plays out, so you need to decide, are you going to continue down this road? And if you are you going to actually do what it takes to try to give yourself a better chance? Or do you decide that the window, realistically speaking, pragmatically speaking, is closed, and then you do need to look to deal Machado and Zach Britton and just go down the list.
But they don't have anything else to come in. You know what I mean? Like when the Yankees did that last year, they had guys. You know what I mean?
They traded for some of those guys though too. I mean, you're right. I mean, I agree, but you can't do this. You can't do a rebuild halfway. That's what got the Orioles in trouble in the late '90s and the early 2000s to begin with. They would spend some money just for the sake of doing it, and they would have no chance to win. And it was almost on paper, it was like, well, if everything breaks perfectly, we might be able to finish 500. And that was kind of the model.
But you're hanging around with Chris Davis as though, like, giving a guy that kind of money in the middle of this thing.
Well,
means you better be trying because you're not getting rid of him.
I agreed, but that's what I'm saying. They need to decide that whether they're going to continue to try for the next 2 years and then see where the chips fall after 2018, and then you're really falling off a cliff with no inventory of prospects, or you decide we see the writing on the wall and we need to make a decision. The problem is, when you have a general manager whose contract expires after next year and a manager whose contract expires after next year, you have no way of letting them know that they can buy into that or not. Now, it's very simple if you say, and again, this is ownership talking. You either decide that you need to rebuild this thing and you tell Dan Duquette that, and he either says, I'm not in for that, I resign, or you get rid of him, or you extend him. It's that's the way it has to be. You can't have him orchestrating a rebuild when he's a lame duck general manager. That's asking for disaster.
But you do know this is not the way Peter operates.
I understand.
You know that. You're like, the odds of something like that happening, the odds of Duquette getting fired before the end of his term, or Buck getting fired before the end of his term, or them getting re-signed long-term. I mean, first off, I don't think either one of these guys would say to Peter Angelos at 86, sure, give me 4 more years right now of this. I think they want to get to the end of their deal. They want to go out and explore. They want to sniff around.
I don't know about that with Buck. He said numerous times that this is his last manager job. Now, whether he retires, whether he goes into TV, whatever, I think that's the case with Duquette. I'm not sure that's the case with Buck Showalter, but you have to establish a direction before anyone can make a decision whether they want to cut bait or whether they want to re-up. I mean, it's just, you can't be in limbo, and that's where they have to decide this sooner rather than later what they're going to do.
Well, now they're in crisis mode. I mean, deciding this stuff in the offseason and having strategy and all, and having 5 different lines, and if it goes really well or really poorly and along the way, I've never felt like there's a roadmap for this organization. Matter of fact, I know there's not a roadmap. I knew Flanagan too well. You know what I mean? Like, there was never this pathway. That's what I'm writing about in the book this summer, is that, it meanders, and right now it's meandered into a direction that I don't think that they were prepared for, which is this Machado stinking, guys are injured, front office not getting along, not competitive. Here come the Yankees, here come the Red Sox again, and we've all lived through a decade or a decade and a half of that. When they start getting good players, they keep them, they groom, they spend money, they try hard, they're smarter than the average bear. And this doesn't bode well for the next 5 years here. I mean, the ship's seeing the rocks right now, and they better make sure this isn't the Titanic.
Well,
as a franchise, I'm talking about. Not Buck or Dan. I'm talking about where are they going to be in 19, 20, and 21. And a lot of that gets decided in the next 6 weeks, and I don't think they're prepared to make those decisions.
Well, you have to roll with the punches. And honestly, I mean, look at the 2015 Ravens. They weren't expecting to go 5-11, and what did they do? They kind of patched it and tried to make another run with that basic core, and they went 8-8 last year. And this year we've seen them make more drastic changes, not a full rebuild. And look, it's football compared to baseball, but my point is things aren't always going to go the way you plan. And that's where they do have to make a decision here. Now, they've known for quite a while that their window, as this club was currently constructed, was going to close next year unless they made a huge jump in payroll. I mean, this team's $150 million payroll. It's a top 10, top 11 kind of payroll. They're spending a lot more money than they did 5 years ago. So, we 5 years ago we would have never dreamed that someone like Chris Davis would get a $161 million contract. I mean, it's just stuff that we never even bothered discussing because it was just something that sounded so ridiculous. So, that's not to say that you can't make some adjustments, but at the same time, if you're confident in Dan Duquette and you're confident in Buck Showalter, then put your money where your mouth is. Extend them then. But if it comes down to you're going to kind of just tread water and hope that things turn around this year, and let's say they don't, but they know they still have one more year of Machado and one more year of one more year of Britton and one more year of Jones, and you say, okay, we're going to make one more run at it. Well, then you better go all in and spend and augment the roster, not just kind of go along at the same rate and hope that you're going to get a different result, because there are too many players at this point that are not trending in the right direction. We've talked about it with Davis. Adam Jones is going to be 33 years old or 32 years old, and he's not getting better at this point. You're only hoping he can stay the same, and we've seen some decline there. J.J. Hardy, well documented. I mean, his deal expires, and don't expect him back, obviously, but you've got some aging players, some players that were flawed to begin with, and we knew that. That's nothing new, even with the success they've had over the last 5 years. But you have that, but if you're not going to either A, be creative, or B, be more bold with how you're spending, or a combination of both, whether it's creative trades and going out and getting some pieces you need in the off season, then you're just kind of spinning your wheels, and I don't know what the best case scenario is then for the next year and a half. So this is definitely a time where you don't have to start trading guys tomorrow, but you got to take a long look at this as an organization and kind of decide, what do you want to be, not just right now, not just next year, but more importantly, what do you want to be the next 5 years? And if it's clear Peter Angelos liked Dan Duquette, the fact that he wouldn't let him go to Toronto to begin with, and clearly he has an affinity for Buck Showalter for what he's accomplished over the last 6 years. But if you like him that much and you trust him that much, and then re-up,
But you have to let them do their job too, and that's part of the Chris Davis thing hanging over them. Sure. Is if you re-up here, you've got that to deal with for 4 years after that. So and that money's going to sit on the books, and that money was not something that Buck or Dan would have signed off on, and yet they're stuck with it. So it's dysfunctional, it's unorthodox, but it's the Orioles, and this is a good time to ask about hitting the rocks and who's really running the show around there when things are when the big picture needs to be looked at.
Well, and that's the big thing. I mean, what is it going to be? Is it going to be Dan Duquette? Is it going to be Dan Duquette leaving at some point here, if it's not just when his contract expires, and then Brady Anderson taking over? I don't know.
Wow.
I mean, at this point, those are the questions that have to start being asked. I mean, they were questions that were already being discussed. We've talked about those things off and on for the last year or two, just kind of seeing what the state of this roster was and contracts and what.
I didn't even think of the Brady Anderson running the place thing. How much is he around lately? I mean, since the story came out, the story did no damage. Hell, 90% of the fan base here never even read the thing. I mean, as crazy as it was.
Well, I mean, and that was when it first came out, and that's where I said to you, I mean, look, I thought that was a very balanced look at it. Brady has been an asset to this organization in some ways. In other ways, you can certainly argue that he's been a detriment. But my biggest question in looking at that role specifically is, what's the end game with him? Is he going to continue to be this kind of roving instructor / front office executive, trainer? Which, there's other teams that have started to have guys in different kinds of roles that are, kind of outside the box. But at the same time, how is that fitting into the future if you have a GM whose contract is up after next year and a manager whose contract is up after next year?
But it's also weird that if Buck is going to be the guy who's going to be the GM, have they decided that already? And if they decide that already, he wouldn't sign on to have Brady Anderson still breathing down his neck, and he sort of knows how dysfunctional this place is that it happens to begin with. So, it really does all come back to this isn't a normal kind of place, right? And I don't know that all places, believe me, I don't think the Miami Marlins are any better or worse, or there are other organizations where it's dysfunctional, but I know at that level, those guys really put a lot of consideration into who's the owner's crazy kids, and what's I know that for a fact. And in the NFL, that's part of the problem with the Bills right now being dysfunctional. The Orioles have been that for 25 years. I don't have a whole lot of confidence that whatever moves they're going to make here are going to be well thought through. I mean, am I wrong or am I nuts?
No, I think that's completely fair. I mean, the fact that they had Dan Duquette as their general manager to begin with was a product of others not wanting to work in this.
Yeah, there aren't a whole lot of guys who would take this gig if Brady Anderson or Buck don't want it 2 years from now.
Well, I mean, it's just but those things need to be talked about. Those things need to be determined. And can you find someone else like Dan Duquette, even if it's not your first choice, that can come in and do a good job? Yeah, there's not one right hire to make necessarily in those types of things, but you got to make sure it is a right hire. It doesn't have to be one specific guy, but it can't be the wrong guy. And the Orioles did plenty of hiring the wrong guy in a number of positions for a long, long time. And Dan Duquette, for all of his flaws, and he's not a perfect general manager. He clearly has to wear parts of this. There's no doubt about that. And coaching staff, players, everyone has to wear it. But at the same time, Dan Duquette's done a lot of good too. And I don't think he should be void of any credit just because of him being unorthodox and him not necessarily being their first choice, and the fact that Andy McPhail laid some of the groundwork. But at the same time, if he's not going to be the guy, well, you better find someone who can do the job, because you're right. I mean, you look at where this franchise stands, starting at the top with the ownership and not knowing what that's going to look like, and realizing what Peter Angelos' age is, and not knowing how involved his sons are going to be moving forward when he's gone, and just top to bottom, the farm system, the lack of spending, international scouting. I mean, all of that. I mean, you look at all of that, and it's tough not to be extremely concerned with where this team has been. And that's not to say that this team currently, the current roster, can't turn things around and be a wild card contender. But all these issues we talk about are still going to be there. Whether this team wins, and regroups and wins 89 games, or whether they win 80, or whether they lose 90 games. I mean, all of those same issues that we're talking about were always there. It's just they come into much sharper focus now, seeing that they're not getting the results on the field in the way they have over the last several years. And
well, also when Manny Machado's hitting 220. I mean,
Sure.
that's a big part of this, right?
Sure. I mean, that's what I said. I mean, their two best players from a year ago were Manny Machado and Zach Britton. Zach Britton's barely been on the field for them, and Manny Machado has been a shell of what he normally is. I mean, those two factors alone, if you take everything else out of the equation, that right there is going to create for some regression. I mean, it's natural. And then you couple that with everything else that's gone on, and not doing enough to help the pitching staff, and Chris Tillman being a shell of what he's been, and not sure what's going on with Kevin Gausman. I mean, you can talk about all these other individuals, guys that they've called up, and Alberto Jimenez, him struggling, not surprising. Wade Miley,
right.
I mean, go down the list. I mean, most of those guys, if you told me at the beginning of the year that they would struggle, I'd say, okay, not exactly shocking there. But
yeah, with Gausman, we're looking for the ceiling, not the floor.
Kevin Gausman, and again, take out the expectation or the hope of him becoming an ace. This is a guy who had a 3.77 ERA over the last 3 seasons. That's at the very least a solid middle-of-the-rotation starting pitcher in this day and age in the major leagues. It's not an ace, but it's at least someone that you pencil in every fifth day and say, going to give us a good chance to win. And Kevin Gausman was that for 3 years. That's why I don't buy the Jake Arrieta, Brian Mattis kind of talk with him, because those individuals never established themselves in Baltimore as starting pitchers. So my question with him, I get it with Tillman. Either the shoulder is shot or his mechanics, he has to alter it so he's not in pain. It hasn't worked. It's obvious. The other guys, not surprising. But for Kevin Gausman to have a 6.5 ERA, that's where I do ask questions. And look, I'm the last guy that says fire the pitching coach, fire the defensive coordinator, fire the GM, fire the coach. I mean, we hear all that stuff all the time, and we're so quick to blame coaches rather than the players who are the most responsible for the performance on the field. But for Kevin Gausman to, forget about taking a step. This is a guy who's taken 4 colossal steps backwards. I mean, it is just mind-boggling to me. But when you have that, and you had a team that had question marks with its pitching staff anyway, and then you've had injuries in the bullpen, again, I look at this and say, it's almost a miracle that they're a game over 500 at this point. And, I mean, it's just, it's not good. And I don't know what the answer is, but as you said, you can't exactly look at the minor leagues right now and say that there's much help along the way. Yeah, there's some guys like Cody Sedlock, and there's some guys who might be of help down the road, talking 2-3 years from now. But as far as someone that's going to be called up and help them immediately, I'm not seeing anyone on that list that gives any optimism whatsoever.
Last thing, any wrap on the Yankees weekend for you? I mean, other than the Yankees are good, and I know we started with that, but just more like this was a wow. This was a real nut punch for the whole organization, right? And the fact that we're sitting around here on a Monday morning, had they won somehow Saturday or, I don't know, not been blown out in the way they were, do you think we're being a little overreactive that the pitching could somehow come back to mediocre next week when they're seeing different teams? Or do you think that, all I could think about was in the 7th inning when they're losing 14-3 or whatever the hell it was. I'm thinking, what's that bus ride to JFK going to be like? What's that flight to Chicago going to be like? I have a feeling Sunday night was a very, very long night for the organization after that, because that was outrageous, quite frankly. It was an outrageous weekend in New York.
Oh, it was embarrassing. It was absolutely humiliating. There's no doubt about that. Now, the pitching, they gave up 38 runs in 3 games. No pitching staff in the history of baseball is that bad. I mean, that it will stabilize to some point. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to be good or even mediocre, but they ran into a buzzsaw and they completely, all over the
I think the Aaron Judge 495-foot home run would. That
was impressive. I mean, he is.
That'll hurt some feelings, is all I'm saying. Right?
It will, but. You know what the defining moment of the weekend for me was? It was the 2nd inning on Saturday after Tillman had given up 6 runs. I mean, he got the first 2 outs of the inning, and it was just staggering to see how that snowballed and fell apart. In the 2nd inning, he gets Hicks to ground out. He walks Judge on 4 pitches. He walks Matt Holliday on 4 pitches. He goes 3-0 on Starling Castro, and then he absolutely just grooves one right down the middle. Castro hits it 440 feet, And just the way that Chris Tillman reacted to that, I mean, it was sad. It absolutely was. And I'm talking specifically about Chris Tillman, but for this entire pitching staff, I mean, that was such a moment of not even coming close to being competitive. And that was kind of, for me, that was the defining moment of the entire series. And there were some other things too. I mean, let's not completely let the offense off the hook. Let's not let the defense off the hook. I mean, there were some ugly defensive plays on Sunday. There was a play that I was kind of surprised because I was just walking through the room into my kitchen to get something to drink. It was when Chris Davis in the sixth inning lined one down past the shift down the right field corner, bounced off the wall. I looked away and assumed it was a double. He settled for a single in that ball. And look, I get it. The Orioles were behind at that point, and you don't want to get thrown out at second base. I understand that, and believe me, I'm someone that is going to be the first to say don't take a chance there. But to me, it looked like such a basic, no-brainer kind of double off the right field wall. It was hit hard, but it wasn't smoked.
Dude, I think hustle's been an issue. I got on Adam Jones in April. I got on Machado in May. I mean, there's been some issues here where they haven't played heady baseball, let's say, right?
There have, but at the same time, every team has that kind of stuff from time to time. But to the point where Chris Davis is someone who normally, for all of his faults, he's a guy who runs to first base, and he's a guy who hustles, and he's not someone who generally has made a lot of mistakes in that context. But I just saw that, and the way he just jogged around first base, and that just, to me, that was such a sign of this entire club having given up. And at that point, it was 7-3. I had no designs that they were going to stage another comeback like they did against Pittsburgh last week at Camden Yards. But that was something that just kind of stuck in my craw. That, wait a second, you didn't get to second base on that? I mean, I was really, really surprised.
How much are we paying you?
but at the same time, it comes back to it. You can point to the offense and say, well, they only scored 8 runs combined over the 3 innings. But when you're giving up 5 and 6 runs in the first inning, I don't care how motivated you are. I don't care how much heart you have, grit. That is going to suck the absolute wind out of your sails.
Hey, dude, they should have never have beaten the Pirates 2 games they won. I mean, the games they've won this week have been miraculous, quite frankly, right? I mean, like 2 of the more miraculous victories we've seen in recent times when you consider the score in the 7th inning, and then this weekend to get blown out. I mean, it really is kind of getting off the rails here right now.
Oh, it's completely off the rails. I mean, the question is, are they going to be able to get back on the rails to some degree at least? I mean, it's just... over the last 4 games, going back to that makeup game in D.C. on Thursday night, the Orioles have given up 15 runs in the first inning over their last 4 games. I mean, that is complete. That's like T-ball. I mean, that's Little League right there. I mean, that is completely unacceptable. And is there going to be a trickle-down effect to other phases of the club when you have that? Yeah, I think it's human nature. And that's not to excuse Chris Davis or Jonathan Scope for booting a ball on Sunday, or Trey Mancini having his issues in left field on Sunday, but it's a trickle-down effect. When you have something that is so far below what the expectation should be as major leaguers, yeah, it is going to suck the absolute energy out of a team, and they really look like a team that gave up on Sunday. And I do not use phrasing like that lightly, because I think that's overblown a lot of times. I think a lot of times we equate effort with results, and Sunday was one of those times where all the way around that looked like a team that gave up.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter as well, and we'll be monitoring everything out in Chicago this week and continuing to discuss the Orioles in every way possible. You can find me, Nasty, at WNST.net, out on the internet, anywhere it is served, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, all those good places. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports. Let me take a breather here on this, and my thing's pinwheeling, my live button's pinwheeling, so I want to make sure I don't lose my audio on it. So,
okay.
No, I'm all good. You want to do football in about 5 minutes?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, man, thanks.
All right, yep.